class. This lecture is to help you get started with your paper on Huckleberry Finn. And it should be pretty fun because one of the great joys in life is telling people why they are wrong and you are right. And that is the whole goal of this paper. So we talked a little bit in class about the various ways to respond to other people's opinions. And I've got some examples of the sort of 3 different modes of response here, so just so you can get a better idea of what this looks like. Now the first one is dismissal. And in a dismissal, you're just saying, like, look, this point doesn't matter, it isn't important, it's not relevant to the argument at hand. So you don't actually engage with it so much as you sort of brush it aside and say this isn't important. Now you have to have, of course, a good reason to do that. You can't just like take a convincing argument and be like, I don't care, because then your argument will fail to be persuasive. But here's an example of a dismissal from Leo Marx's essay. Mr. Eliot and Mr. Trilling deny this. The overriding consideration for them is form which seems largely to mean symmetry of structure. It is fitting, Mr. Eliot maintains, that the book should come full circle and bring Huck once more under Tom's sway. Now notice that this part that I just read, that's in this sort of reddish color, is a paraphrase. It's important to begin with an accurate understanding of what your opponent is saying. And notice that he doesn't really put in any sort of judgments or enter his own opinion quite yet. He's just trying to state what Eliot thinks about the ending as clearly as possible. And then, in Brown, he's going to come up with his own response to this idea. But it seems to me that such structural unity is imposed on the novel and therefore is meretricious. If you don't know what meretricious means, you should look it up. Here, the controlling principle of form apparently is unity, but unfortunately a unity much too superficially conceived. Structure, after all, is only one element, indeed one of the more mechanical elements of unity. So he's dismissing Eliot's, opinion that the structural unity of the book is important, and says, you know what, it's just not that big of a deal. Structure is not so important to the unity of a book that we should judge the ending based on how well it creates this kind of structure. So that's his response, his dismissal of that particular element of Eliot's argument about the ending of the book. Now, one of the most common forms of response, and one that you guys are probably going to end up using quite a lot, is rebuttal. And rebuttal is sort of a head-on disagreement with the author's point. You're going to say, you know what, this conclusion you've drawn is wrong, and here is why. This particular example is from an author named Zuckert, and it uses the form of rebuttal that includes a counterexample. We talked about that in class. So if your opponent is using an example, you can bring up a counterexample and say, well, what about this? This doesn't fit what you are trying to say. When they argue that Miss Watson's change of heart at the end of the novel is incredible, neither H.M. Smith nor Leo Marx pays attention to the fact that Jim runs before Miss Watson has entirely made up her mind. So notice that in that sentence, this is basically a transitional sentence, which is why the paraphrase of the argument is fairly brief and just the first half of the sentence. But again, it is an accurate summary of the opinions of those that she is trying to counter here. And then she follows up with her claim. I've color-coded it so you can see that her introduction of this counterexample uses that claim, quote, and explain structure that we talked about all the way back at the beginning when you were first writing papers. Remember when I said that when you're introducing evidence, this is the 3-part structure you should use to make sure that it's fully embedded in your paper and it's sort of fully pulling its weight as a reason. So the last part of that sentence is her claim. Jim runs before Miss Watson has entirely made up her mind. Then she's going to introduce a quote to show that this is true. He tells Huck that, I hear old Mrs. tell de Witter she going to sell me down to Orleans, but she didn't want to. But she could get $800 for me, and it was such a big stack of money she couldn't resist. DeWitter, she tried to get her to say she wouldn't do it, but I never waited to hear the rest. I lit out mighty quick, I tell you. And this particular author has added those italics in as a way to point to the reader to the particular parts that she wants them to pay attention to. That's not something I want you to do. You don't need to be messing with the typesetting of the original quotations, but it is something that authors sometimes do. And so this author has an additional sentence, in essence providing an additional reason for why Miss Watson would reject this temptation. Miss Watson's Christian morals, rigid and strict, as we know from Huck, stand against materialism, so she's kind of giving an additional motive for Miss Watson to turn down $800. And then this is her explanation, right? She's following up from the quotation. She doesn't just let it sit there. We do not know that she actually decided to sell Jim over her sister's opposition. In any case, she definitely had an attack of conscience. So this is her counterexample, her rebuttal to the claim that it just doesn't make any sense for Miss Watson to change her mind and set Jim free on her deathbed. In essence, it's a response to that claim that it's just too far-fetched. And this can be both part of the argument about the ending and part of the argument about the racism of the novel as well. And finally, again, we talked about this in class, you can also concede all or part of an opponent's point and say, you know what, this is true, and then you can either just let it sit and say, you know, this is true, but my overall argument still holds, or you can reinterpret it and say, look, this is the point that is significant to me, or this fact is true, but it points to something different than what you think it does. This particular quotation doesn't really have a paraphrase because it's, in essence, transitioning from the paraphrase that was in the previous paragraph. So you can see the first two words are Cox's argument, which this author has just spent the whole last paragraph explaining. Your essay will not be as long as any of these people's essays, so you probably don't have as much, you don't need to spend as much time explaining and outlining an opposition argument as these authors do. But the basic structure still holds, and it is something you will need to follow. So she says, Cox's argument demonstrates the ingenious lengths to which scholars go to feel comfortable with the final chapters of Huck Finn. What scholars must realize is that no amount of interpretive acrobatics can mediate the actual matter of the closing sequence, regardless of Twain's motivations or intent. So this is where she's conceding, like, you know what, you might be right about Twain's intent in these last chapters, what he's trying to accomplish, and then, in essence, there's a but. She's returning to the point that she thinks is significant after she's made this concession. Jim does deflate and climb back into the minstrel costume. His self-respect and manly pursuit of freedom bow subserviently before the childish pranks of an adolescent white boy. In essence, she concedes that Twain might have had good motivations or an intent to accomplish something in his novel, but she's saying, like, look, that doesn't matter given that this actually happened. So she's returning to what she thinks is important. So those are three different ways that you can respond to an opposing argument. So when you come up against something, think about what the best way to respond would be. And as this one demonstrates, it's okay to actually agree. You don't have to disagree with absolutely everything someone on the opposite side of a question has to say. Okay, now that we've looked at how to respond to an opposing argument, let's look at how to organize this kind of paper, because it's a slightly different kind than what you've done before. What you've done before is a straight-up argumentative paper, which is organized around your reasons for holding a particular opinion for your thesis statement, basically. What we've got here is basically a comparison essay, because you're comparing your opinion with the opinion of other people. So the kinds of essay structures that are used for a comparison essay are what's going to work better here. And there are two main forms of organization when you've got a comparison. The first, and perhaps the simplest, is what's called a block organization. And that's where you keep everybody's arguments together in one big chunk. So first you state your own positions with all of your reasons and your supporting evidence. So, you'll keep everything together in maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs. And then you will include your paraphrase, again, of somebody else's argument, your restatement of the opposing position, again, all in one chunk. All of the reasons and all of the evidence presented for the conflicting views. And then, only once you've done that, will you respond to those reasons and evidence. That's sort of in the next paragraph. So you'll be referring back to what you've already told your readers about the argument. So, in response to this piece of that argument, you can dismiss the first reason, you can provide a counterexample to their examples, but you're going to do this all in one place. So your essay will have sort of 3 basic chunks, and you'll probably need more than just 3 paragraphs, but in essence, you'll have 1 or 2 paragraphs in the first chunk, 1 or 2 paragraphs in the second chunk, and 1 or 2 paragraphs in the third chunk. And the benefit of this is that it's sort of easier to see the argument as a whole because all of the pieces are kept together, both of your argument and of your opponent's argument. The downside of this is that your response only comes sort of at the end, and you have to refer back to what you've talked about in a previous paragraph, which can be a little bit more difficult to follow for a reader. So there are pros and cons for each of these. The other main form of organization is what's called point by point. Again, these names are fairly illustrative of what they are. You respond to each point as it arises. So in this case, you'll pick a topic, some piece of the ending, like in the example you were just looking at, say Miss Watson's decision to free Jim. You'll describe their point of view, and then you will respond to that before moving on to your opponent's next reason or objection to whatever question you're trying to answer. So you respond to the points as they come up. And then at the end of, once you've responded to all of their ideas, you can add in some that, of your own ideas that are not necessarily, responding to an objection, but adding to your own argument. This one can be easier to follow and so a little bit more persuasive because it's easier to see like, well, they say this, but obviously this is the case instead, because you're responding to that objection as soon as it comes up. It can be a little bit trickier to organize because it involves more transitions back and forth because you have to keep switching between their perspective, your perspective, to a new topic, their perspective, your perspective, new topic. So it requires a little bit more careful handling in order to keep your reader following along and not getting lost. But either one of these would work. You can try, putting your ideas in an outline and then arranging it in a block style and arranging it in a point-by-point style and seeing which seems like it's going to work better for you. But one or the other of these should be in place for your draft. That's due next Thursday. I hope this is helpful to you guys. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I hope you enjoy arguing with people. See you next week.